Thanks everybody for your lovely comments in the chat. It's great to be here today. As Sean said, my name is Sarah Rogerson. I'm going to be here to talk about effective feedback in the digital classroom. I'll be talking for about 45 minutes, maybe a few minutes left given the delays, and then I'll leave some time for questions, obviously. I'm going to create some interactive opportunities, so I'd appreciate your engagement in the chat box. So thank you everybody for joining today. I hope the slides move forward and everything goes without problem from now on. So just a little bit about me. I'm the Director of Assessment at OUP. I'm responsible for a range of summative and formative assessments that are used for students globally. Sean introduced me. I've previously taught in Taiwan, lived there for 7 years. I've worked at Cambridge, and I think it's important to understand what really drives me, and I'm really driven by assessment for good and the right assessments for the right purpose, because often I think assessment isn't used particularly well. And a big part of good assessment is that it should result in feedback that informs teachers and students to improve learning. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today, effective feedback. And this is really important to me personally, and I can see Sonia is from Portugal, because I'm learning Portuguese right now. And I've been learning Portuguese for, gosh, about 2 years maybe now. And I really know the power of feedback, because sometimes I get feedback from my teacher which isn't particularly helpful, and it makes me really struggle with learning. And sometimes I get feedback which is really, really helpful. So I think it's really important for us to focus on feedback today. And these are the reasons why we want to focus on feedback. Oh, sorry, these are the learning intentions for today's session. But before we go into the learning intentions, I was going to talk about why we want to focus on feedback. But let's look at the learning intentions first. So the learning intentions for today's session are that after the session, you'll be able to understand the features of effective feedback, and you'll be able to apply effective feedback in your own teaching. And finally, you will be able to understand the features of digital tools that enrich feedback. I hope they all make sense, and I hope they are things that you are signed up for today. So now let's look at why feedback. And there are 3 important reasons why I want to look at feedback today. One is that effective feedback can lead to another 5 months progress in a school year. How amazing is that? That if teachers are effectively doing feedback, and it's the effective thing we're going to talk about today, if teachers are effectively applying feedback, your students could have an extra 5 months progress in a school year. That's pretty phenomenal, right? So I'm sure you will agree, looking at the effective stuff is really important. Secondly, there's a well-known report I think it's by OECD, that says that students in schools that seek feedback from students perform better than students in schools that do not. So we have to view feedback as a very multi-dimensional thing. As teachers, you are fundamentally responsible for helping your students with feedback, but also in asking your students for feedback on your performance, and that's going to in your teaching performance, and that's going to really help you develop your own teaching and then develop the classroom. And then the third point that I wanted to talk about is this. There are all these positives, but apparently 30% of classroom feedbacks takes learning backwards. So when feedback isn't given properly, learning goes backwards. And so that's why today's session is really focused on the kind of feedback that takes learning forwards. There's a lot of really good chat going on, which is really great to see. So effective feedback is the type of feedback that takes learning forwards. Let's keep that in mind today. We want to focus on feedback that's going to take learning forwards. And when we think about the digital classroom, we're thinking about not just a classroom that is virtual. We're talking about any type of class where part of the delivery medium is online. And I'm sure a lot of you are doing part of your teaching online, whether that's setting homework, whether that's doing some particular classes online, but the digital classroom obviously over the past 2 years has become increasingly important. And then we'll talk about visible learning. Visible learning is something that John Hattie came up with. And visible learning is teachers seeing learning through the eyes of their students and students seeing themselves as their own teachers. And they're the three things we're going to be looking at today. Effective feedback in the digital classroom, and how that makes learning visible. I'm just going to pause quickly so I can just check some of the things that are happening in the chat box. So yeah, it seems that lots of people agree that feedback is fundamental to the classroom. It helps people understand their weakness, and it makes a big difference to everybody. So yes, and these are the three things we're going to talk about today, and I hope that's what you're signed up for. Everything that I'm going to talk about today comes from OUP position papers. So if there's anything I say today that you're interested in, that you want to learn more about, that you've got questions about, go to the link here and you can download our position papers. The position papers I'm particularly looking at today are the position papers on effective feedback, the position papers on global skills, creating empowered 21st century learners, and the position paper on learner agency, maximizing learner potential. So these are our global expert panel papers, and these are really important for you to understand if you've got any follow-up questions from today's talk. So let's dive right in and look at the 7 features of effective feedback. So in one of the OUP Global Expert Panel papers on assessment for learning, we talk about 7 key elements of feedback. And the first one is that feedback needs to be specific and clear. And if we think about specific and clear, I hope you all know what that means. We don't want the teacher just saying to the student, "Oh, you need to write more," because that's not really helping the student. So instead of the teacher saying to the student, "You need to write more," they need to give much more specific feedback. Can you think about any feedback that you might give to a student on their writing that is a bit more specific? If you can you write that in the chat box, please? So we're looking for some feedback that you might give to a student on their writing, which is a bit more specific than "you need to write more." What kind of feedback might you give to your students? Absolutely, there's lots of people saying you need to be specific, you need to be focused. Excellent. So Margot's saying you need to work more on verb forms. This is a really good piece of specific example that the student can go away and do something with. There's some really good examples coming through now. Focus on verb noun agreement, make it concrete, focus on vocabulary, work on paragraph structure. Excellent. So let's move on from that. So that's one thing. Make sure your feedback is specific and clear. The second thing is we want to have well-timed feedback. So the important thing is to give students time to act on feedback. Giving students time to act on the feedback is a positive, and that's the kind of feedback that moves learning thought forwards. So if you take a piece of student work and give their feedback, you then need to have some kind of follow-up activity that the student can go away and think about and move their learning forwards, because the worst kind of feedback, and if I think about it myself as a Portuguese language learner, is when I'm just told that pronunciation isn't good. I then need examples of what good looks like and some follow-up activities so that I can make sure that my pronunciation then becomes better. So make sure that you focus on giving students time to follow up on the feedback, and also think about when you're giving feedback. Sometimes with beginner students, you might want to give feedback immediately to stop any mistakes fossilizing, but that could also be demotivating. So you really need to think about what's best for your students in terms of the timing of the feedback. Okay, number 3, and this is the one we're going to focus on most today. So I'm not going to talk about this too much at the moment because we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this one. It needs to be linked to learning and success criteria. So That's one we're going to come back to. So I'll move on from that. Number 4, when we think about feedback, we need to focus on the task and not the learner. Now, feedback can be a very, very sensitive area. I think if anyone's got, we take this a bit personally, if you've got friends or a partner, you're probably giving feedback to each other all the time, and sometimes it might not be very nice, right? Because it's a sensitive thing to be told, maybe you can improve, or maybe you've done something wrong. So it's crucial that the teacher focuses on the task and not on the individual learner. Some examples of where this doesn't happen is, so I've got children, and if I was to say to my son, from when he does his homework, good boy, I'm focusing on him as being a good boy, which puts a lot of pressure on him to continue to be a good boy. The best type of feedback is to say, okay, you've done your homework really well. Your spellings are good. So it's really focusing on the task and not the learner, because the opposite of good boy is bad boy, right? And that is really, really demotivating. So when you're giving feedback, focus on the task that the student's done, not the actual individual. So Margot said it excellently. You need to praise the behavior. Number 5 is about learning cues. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. If you want to know more, I've given you the links. But what this means is we need to make sure that the feedback is at the right level for the learner. You're going to give different kinds of feedback to people with different levels of ability. So focus on learning cues in your feedback. The 6th point is about strategies and not solutions. The quote to think about here is the give a man a fish quote, really. Feedback shouldn't give students the answer, the solution. We don't want to give them the solution, because we want our students to go away and come up with a solution themselves. So feedback should provide students with the opportunity to develop strategies to improve their learning. And then if we move on to the final point, feedback should be actionable and achievable. So the feedback you give your students, they should be able to go away and do something about, and they should be able to achieve that thing. There's no point giving students feedback that is beyond their capabilities. And I'm just going to pause there. And Marie's asking why the 3rd point's in bold, and that's because that's the focus of this talk today, Marie. We're going to be talking about learning intentions and success criteria as being fundamental to feedback, and we're going to be having some conversations about that in the chat. And William, I'm glad that you think point 6 is really important, and I think it's important too, because I think we've all been students, and lots of us continue to be students. And when you just are given, if the wrong answer's crossed out and the right answer's written in, what do you learn from that? You're not learning anything from that. And Sawad, I'm really glad that you get the point of point 4, and I think this one is really, really important. We don't want to demotivate our students, right? We want the feedback to be taking learning forwards, and the way that we do that is by focusing on their behavior and their performance, and not on them as an individual. Okay, it's really great to see so much engagement in the chat box. So I said we're going to focus on number 3 today. So let's have a look at number 3 in a bit more detail. If I can move the slide forwards. So this is about learning and success criteria. And the quote from our paper is, any feedback given to students is most effective when it is related to learning intentions and success criteria in order to provide consistency or constructive alignment across curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. There is a lot in that quote. I hope it makes sense. We're going to unpack it a bit more. We're going to look at learning intentions and success criteria. But fundamentally, if you have a course, what the best way to approach that is to have that course built upon learning intentions, and to have the success criteria from different activities built on the same learning intentions. There's no point setting a learning intention with a success criteria that doesn't match. And we're going to look at this in a lot more detail. So I'm just going to read that again to you. Any feedback given to students is most effective what we want to do today, when it is related to learning intentions and success criteria in order to provide consistency or constructive alignment across curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. Thank you, Dion. I'm really happy you're enjoying the presentation. So let's have a look in a bit more detail at learning intentions. Now, learning intentions, you might hear them called learning outcomes, you might hear them called learning objectives. We're really talking about the same thing here, right? A learning intention is a teacher-created statement clearly outlining what the teacher intends students to be able to do as a result of the lesson. At the beginning of this session, I set you some learning intentions for this session, and we'll revisit them at the end of the session. But that's what a learning intention is. It's the teacher saying, this is what I intend you to learn from today's session. I put some examples here, and these examples will become more important later. So some examples that you might give to a student about a piece of writing, or after this session, students will be able to understand the linking words and but to organize writing. Students will be able to use accurate vocabulary to accept invitations, and students will be able to create a short email to reply to an invitation. So there are some examples of learning intentions. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to write in the chat, how would you write a learning intention? Can you give me, if you were training another teacher on how to write learning intentions, what might you say to them? It's learning objectives, Leo, too. How might you write a learning objective? Are there any top tips that you might give about how to write a learning intention? I'm having some sound issues too, Linda. Some strange noises. Sean, is there anything I can do about that?
I'm trying to work out what it is. You're the only on mic, but it's not you. So I just think it's the system being a bit glitchy.
Okay. Focusing on the so we'll try and work through this.
Well, we'll work on it, Sarah. Just work through it.
Okay. So I saw someone put active verbs. Somebody put focusing on the simplest verbs. In terms of competencies, by the end of the session, you'll be able to start with a verb. So there's some really good potential solutions there. And I've prepared some. I think I saw somebody put Bloom's taxonomy, but these are some things that I've prepared. So my top tips really are, oh my word, to write in student-friendly language, to begin with a verb, and
okay, just stop for a moment, Sarah.
Okay.
Let's see. Right, come back. I've muted you. Come back and let's see if that's better.
Hello, I'm here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go for it.
Right, keep going. Okay. Sorry about the sound, everybody.
It's good now. I've removed it, I think.
So learning intention should be written in student-friendly language, should probably begin with a verb. You know, you might start after this session, you will be able to verb, and they should be relatively short. And like everybody said, some people like using Bloom's taxonomy as a way to make those learning intentions gradually become more difficult as your students' ability gets higher. So we are going from remembering to creating. So that's some information about learning intentions. And with that in mind, what I want to do now is to move on to success criteria. And I'm going to, again, ask you to work with me in the chat. So if we look at the task, that's the one in the pink. So there's a task. Imagine you've given your students this task. Hey there, I'm having a party on Saturday night at my house. It's for Manjeet. We're going to start at 6 p.m. I hope you can come. If you can come, can you bring some small cakes? Please let me know as soon as you can. Write a reply to Sam in about 30 words. So the success criteria I'm proposing here is write a good response to Sam. What do you think about that as a success criteria? Do you think that is a good success criteria to provide to your student? Margot has got the point exactly. We've said, and Angela is saying, no, it's too broad, it's too general. Okay, excellent. So you're all entirely right. It's too vague. What is a good response? Who judges whether it's a good response? If your student goes away and writes a story about Spider-Man, is that a good response? If your student fulfills everything we ask them to do, but writes it in 4 words, is that a good response? It's a bit too specific. It's a bit too general, and it's very subjective, really. So you're all saying no. Okay, let's try again. What about this success criteria? Tell Sam that you can go and we'll bring some cakes. What do we think about that? Do we think that is a good success criteria or not? So we've got another one here, and it looks like we've got not very good. It's better. It's not specific. Better, better, better. Okay, so there's lots of people saying it's better, but some people saying it's no. And what I would say, being a bit of an assessment geek, is your student could take this success criteria, and that could be their entire response. Hi, Sam, I can go and we'll bring some cakes. So you're giving your student the whole answer there, and it's really not very meaningful. It's probably better than the first one, but it's not very meaningful. As Claudia says, it lacks some guidance. We're not really getting much from that. So let's move on to a third one. Okay, write a response to Sam, focusing on using good grammar, not making any spelling mistakes. What do you think about this success criteria? So this is the third one. Write a response to Sam, focusing on using good grammar, not making any spelling mistakes. How do we feel about this one? There was a question about what kind of cake you like, and that made me feel suddenly very hungry. We've got people saying it's nice, it's too general. Margot, exactly what grammar to focus on? So we've got this word good again. What is good grammar? Is good grammar good grammar? Who knows? And you know, the grammatical functions that you use and that we determine as good, which is a very woolly word, they change depending on what level of English you are, what level of language you are, right? So if you're an A1 student, good grammar might be using the present simple tense, conjugating some verbs. If you're a C2 student, it's very, very different. And what do you all think about this one, not making any spelling mistakes? It kind of depends on your learning intentions, but not making any spelling mistakes. I think Silvino says exactly, it creates a lot of pressure to not make any spelling mistakes. And, you know, does it matter if there's one spelling mistake in there? It's quite restrictive. It's not really talking about the kind of language that you want or the kind of spelling that you want. So Vagier is saying that's not good cues as well. So I've prepared one that I think is a little bit better. And I've put that here, these success criteria here. So the success criteria now are good organization, gives the necessary information to the reader, accurate vocabulary and grammar. So this is an example of maybe some slightly better success criteria. It depends on what you're teaching, it depends on what your learning intentions are, but I set the learning intentions early. So here are some examples of some much better success criteria. The student knows they've got to use good organization. If the learning intention, as I said before, was use and but to organize your language, then they can link that back. The learning intention is around answering Sam. Again, we're giving the necessary information to the reader, and we want some accurate vocabulary and grammar. And you might want to be more specific about that depending what you've taught in the class. But these are an example of some better learning objectives, better success criteria. So far, we've looked at feedback, the importance of feedback. We know it takes learning forwards. We've looked at effective feedback. We've said there are 7 features of effective feedback. I've talked about them broadly, and the one I think is really, really important is the one about learning intentions and success criteria, because you can give feedback against learning intentions and success criteria. And we've looked at how you could write a good learning intention, right? We've said they need to be short. We've said they need to be written in student-friendly language. And we've said they should probably start with a verb, and you could get those verbs from Bloom's taxonomy. And we've looked at success criteria, and we've kind of agreed together that some examples I've showed you aren't very good because those examples were either too general, too specific, or not meaningful. So what's missing now to kind of fully get into this presentation is how to give feedback digitally. Everything I've spoken about now has been output agnostic. I'm not talking about you give this feedback online, you give this feedback on paper, you give this feedback face to face. It's been about effective communication between teacher and student to enable learning to be visible and driven forwards. And I'm going to use an analogy here when we talk about giving feedback digitally. So if you look at these 2 pictures, we've got 2 conversations happening using old and modern technology. And the output is a conversation maybe between friends. And that output is the same. There's nothing maybe different in the conversation in the past using the old technology and the conversation now using the new technology. What has changed is the ease of facilitating the conversation and the additional features current technology allows. For example, the video call. In the same way, the principles of effective feedback remain the same whether you're teaching a traditional face-to-face class or a fully fledged virtual class. So effective feedback does not change if it's digital or face-to-face. It's just effective feedback. What we've spoken about now is just some effective principles of pedagogy to improve learning outcomes. But in this world, people are required to give feedback via digital mediums because of the changing face of education. And in the same way as the pictures that you can see right now, giving feedback digitally is often easier and there are more features available to the teacher. Okay, so if we think about feedback, digital does not change what effective feedback looks like. Effective feedback is effective feedback. It's about it being well timed. It's about it being at the right level. It's about it focusing on the activity and not the person. They're the features of effective feedback that we've spoken about. That doesn't change if it's digital. But what does change is that if you have digital technology, if you give feedback digitally, you have things that are easier to do. Can you let me know in the chat box what features of digital technology do you think enhance feedback? Is there anything about giving feedback online that makes it easier? In the same way as when we have a FaceTime conversation with our friends, it's an easier conversation than in the old technology phones. So we're saying it's more effective, we're saying the medium is different. But what does digital really allow us to do? How can we enhance it? Someone wrote document sharing, badges, Padlet, emojis. I love a good emoji. Yeah, lots of really good ideas coming through. Video response, chat. It's speedy, said Ting Ting Ting. Lots of people are saying speed. Lots of people are talking about emojis. The chat is moving so fast that I think I'm getting quite dizzy, but I can handle that. We've got people saying oral feedback. We've got people saying I do it through WhatsApp. I think there are so many tools that are underutilized in terms of giving feedback, and you know, WhatsApp is such a great medium. TikTok is a good medium. There are lots of really good mediums. Grammarly, somebody wrote Grammarly. You know, instant feedback, much easier than how we might have done it with a red pen or a green pen before, right? So yeah, really, really good answers. So let's look at the list that I put together. And I've got a dog. My dog is a rescue dog from Cyprus. So I thought I'd put a picture of a dog. This isn't my dog. But you'll see why there's a picture of a dog at the end. So what does digital feedback allow? How do it enhance it? It can be multimodal. So when you're giving your feedback, you can just record a WhatsApp voice message. So I just saw WhatsApp flash up. You can annotate a Google document. You can record a video of yourself giving feedback. It's multimodal. Multimodality means it's more meaningful, means it can be a little bit faster, means you can meet different people where they are. Some people might like really long written feedback. Some people might want just a quick voice message. So digital feedback is multimodal, which makes it more effective for the teacher often. It's immediate. So I'll show you some examples of immediacy later. But if you give in multiple choice quizzes, there is no point whatsoever in you marking those multiple choice quizzes, because the computer can do it faster than you. The computer can do it more consistently correct than you. So digital feedback is immediate. The next one is digital feedback allows you to give a consistent structure, right? And if it's a consistent structure, you can always be given the feedback in the same way, because you're copying and pasting feedback to different students rather than handwriting it each time. It's also, you can also give links, which somebody's mentioned. So you could say, actually, I didn't think your vocabulary was broad enough here. Here, go to the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary or go to the thesaurus and find some different words. And you can just link people straight through. It's saving students time. It's saving you energy. It's making your life a little bit easier. And Sandra, I don't think that is an ugly dog, but it's a picture of a dog. It's time saving, and this has got to be, I just put time saving and mine just wrote time saving on the screen at the same time. Time saving. I've been a teacher, and the one thing that you never have enough time for is time. So if you can save your time by letting the computer or the website or whatever you're using focus on some of the more administrative side of marking, that makes things easier for you. You can track progress over time. So with lots of tools, you can have a dashboard that is showing you exactly how your students have performed over time, and you can see them improve or not. And you can have an aggregate, so you can see all of your students' feedback at the same time, and you can be like, everybody's struggling with this thing. I am going to focus my next lesson on this thing, because the value of doing that is more than what I was going to do. So that aggregate feedback is really important. What else have we got? We've got, it's easier for the student to act on because they've got links, for example. It allows choice, which feeds into the learner agency paper. The students can maybe choose follow-up activities. They can choose how they want to receive their feedback. And this is where the dog came in. Finally, the dog won't eat it. That's a bit of a play on words of a traditional excuse in the UK. If someone forgets to do their homework, they say, oh, I'm sorry, the dog ate it. So if you've got digital feedback, you've got no chance of it getting lost or being eaten by a dog, for example. So there's some things that digital feedback allows. And if we look at some examples of that, of what that might look like, that have come up in the chat. So here's an example of what digital feedback can do. We've got gamification. So we've got this motivating star, right? Star's there, student feels happy. They're given some feedback, nice try. They're given a score. And what can they do? They can try again to improve their score. So it's almost like this is a bit of the strategies over solutions. Somebody actually had the dog eat their students' homework once. Wow. That's a good teacher excuse. Sorry, I couldn't grade your homework. The dog ate it. That's great. So if you're looking at digital feedback, this is one example of some of those things that I was talking about before. It's motivating, we've got a score, and we've got strategies over solution. The student can go away and they can try again. Let's look at another example. This is what I was talking about being time saving. No point you marking a multiple choice question. If you can get your questions in a quiz tool, there's no point you marking them ever again. It will save you a lot of time. And also what's really good about lots of tools with multiple choice questions is you can also say why an answer is wrong. So here, the students selected got the answer right, but if they'd got the answer wrong, we could have a box flash up that says, this is wrong because da 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 da. Now it's really difficult to do that in a face-to-face context, I suppose, at scale with the whole class. So this is another feature that's really important. And another feature as an example, and these are all OUP tools that I'm showing you right now. Another feature of digital feedback is here that you couldn't do in the classroom. So you can have the student go away, listen to a word, record their own word, and play it back, and they can try again and again and again until they get their pronunciation how they want it or how you want it, I suppose. And this is really like the old school language lab. I'm sure you're all a lot younger than me, but certainly when I was learning French, there was a lot of time in a language lab. But this feature you couldn't do with your whole class face to face at the same time, but digital feedback you can, and it enhances what you would do naturally. And that's what we're talking about today. We're enhancing what you do naturally, what you would always do because you're all great teachers. What you would do naturally. So there's some features of digital feedback. I'm just going to pause quickly and check. Yep. So yes, the pronunciation feedback's later, and people are talking about ALM method back in those times, which I think is about in the old language lab days. Sarah R, who sounds very familiar to me, says her students have been using MS Office. Okay, so there's been some really good comments come through about features of digital feedback. And Maria says students like it more. And I think what's really important to think about is how we consume content in the rest of our lives. Unless we start moving on with teaching and modernizing some of the features of teaching, like the feedback that we're talking about, we risk being left behind quite a lot. We are twin names, Sarah, and Kahoot a good example for that. So I just want to flip back to my learning intentions before I open it up for questions. So my learning intentions today, which was very ambitious for a 45-minute talk, is I understand the features of effective feedback. We spoke about the features of effective feedback, and I'll put that list back up for you in a minute, Karen. You're able to apply effective feedback in your own teaching. So I hope we've looked at the learning intentions and success criteria as a framework for providing effective feedback, and that you've got some tips on how to write those learning intentions and how to make those success criteria specific. And I've also showed you some features of digital tools that enrich feedback. So I hope those learning intentions are what you've experienced today. I just am going to go back to one particular slide that Karen has asked for. I'm not sure, was it this slide, Karen? These are some features of digital feedback, but the slides will be sent around. The session has been recorded, and I've also given, you've also got access to the papers that this talk was based on. So I hope you will be able to go away and find out much more than I can talk about in 45 minutes. And also, you're the true experts here. I've not been in the classroom for a few years. So they're the learning intentions we covered today. I wanted to end with this quote from Gordon Stobart, which I think is really important. An ever-changing world needs learners who can think for themselves and cope with the unfamiliar. By helping students engage with learning, evaluate their progress, and respond to feedback, Assessment for Learning encourages this kind of active, flexible learning. So what I've spoken about in terms of feedback is really a fundamental feature of Assessment for Learning. So I said I would leave 15 minutes for questions, and I have left 15 minutes for questions. So I'm open for any questions now that I can answer or other people in the chat can answer. Wanted to give you an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have about feedback or about this session in general.
So Sarah, well done on leaving 15 minutes. That's very impressive. If you click on the Q&A tab, you will see there are a considerable amount of questions
Oh,
for you to deal
wowza.
with.
I'm going to
There are
give it a
lots.
go.
You will need to scroll through obviously you probably can see about 4, but there's a box full. So
there's
good
there's
luck.
a question. How have you concluded on the 5 months progress? The end of this presentation, Ivana, there are some links for further reading, which is where I've got the information from in this presentation. I can also I can't remember specifically that particular link, but there are links at the end of the presentation, and it's based on not. I would say that the 5 months in progress isn't based specifically on ELT. It's based on education in general, and there's significant research that's talked about the impact of effective feedback and adding 5 months progress. It said that for primary is much more. For me, I might be too negative, but the one I think about is, but if it isn't effective, it takes learning backwards, and that is really problematic, because we've all seen our children, our students have their learning taken backwards a lot over the past 2 years. So whatever we can do to really work with feedback to make sure that we don't continue that is I think a really good thing. Is success criteria, I've got a question from Pemo, is success criteria referred to objectives of the lesson? Yes. So we need to make sure, and there's a quote in here that I think is on green paper, and it's in one of the OUP's thought leadership papers. We need to make sure that we are using a single framework to describe what we're intending and what we're assessing almost. So at OUP, we have a kind of a framework that we use to produce our course books and assessments. And what we want to make sure when giving good feedback is that your curriculum, you can pull your learning intentions from your curriculum, and you can pull your success criteria from your curriculum. So you're always assessing what you're intending to have been learned. So they're all part of the same package. I'm going to answer a question from Almudena. During an online course about gender and education, I noticed it is true that I found different ways to give feedback for boys and girls. What do you think, Sarah? I don't know what I think, Almudena. I think it's not about gender so much as the individual. And I think it's generally agreed that gender's quite a spectrum. So for me, I wouldn't be giving different feedback to boys and girls. I would be giving different feedback to the individual based on their preferences and abilities. I have twins. I have 9-year-old twins, a boy and a girl, and I give them different feedback, not because one's a boy and one's a girl. I don't think that's the reason, but just because they're very different people. So I think when you're giving feedback to your students, it's important to take into account individuality. And when we talk about that multimodality of digital feedback, some of your students, if I think about my son who's dyslexic, it would be most helpful for him to have his feedback as a voice message, because he doesn't have to decode it and struggle with actually reading it. But my daughter, she doesn't have dyslexia, and I think she'd prefer to read it. So I really do think it's an individual thing, but I wouldn't say I'm an expert on that. Okay, so Martinus says, I don't really get it about feedback should give strategies, not solutions. So let me try and explain that again. And I'm going to use a quote that I will probably get wrong. So there's a quote that says, give a man a fish and he can feed himself, teach a man to fish and he can feed the village, or something like that. So if we are giving a student the answer, we are not teaching them anything. We are just saying, replace this word for this word. And they don't learn anything from that experience. So giving them the solution, as in the answer, they're not learning anything from. If we tell the student maybe the grammatical rule, or maybe tell them where to look, or maybe even say, this answer is wrong because, then we're giving them a strategy to figure out how to get it right. So we're encouraging them to go away and figure out how to make it right themselves. I hope that's helped, Martinus, but I think it's really important, and I think it's generally recognized now, that we want to make learning visible. We want to make students be their own teachers to a certain extent. And when the students have left the classroom, they're going to go into this complicated, changing world where they're going to have to figure things out by themselves. And if they've got strategies to figure things out by themselves, that's going to be more helpful in creating that global citizen. So that's kind of what I mean there, Martinus. I hope that's helpful. So I'm just trying to scroll down. How to give meaningful feedback for a presentation. If I've given the presentation, you just write, that was excellent. But in general, to give meaningful feedback on a presentation depends on what your learning intentions were for that presentation. So if you've got your students and maybe they're school students and you want them to learn you want them to practice I'm trying to think what you want them to practice how to some specific words. You want them to practice words that they've learned related to the environment, okay? And you say to your students, okay, I want you to give me a presentation about the environment, and you've given them a question and you said, and the success criteria for this, or you need to use the vocabulary from the unit. I want you to maybe speak for 1 minute, and I want you to have a range of grammatical structures, for example. Then you're giving meaningful feedback on those success criteria. And that's how I would do it. I would say it doesn't matter whether it's a presentation or not. It's just about what you intend your students to learn and do. I would also say that for a presentation, there are certain kinds of feedback that you might want to give immediately, and there's certain kinds of feedback that you might want to wait a while to give so that you can summarize properly. And there's certain kinds of feedback that might be sensitive and you might not want to give in front of the whole class. Just moving on. Can you give examples of learning intentions for a mixed ability classroom? That's from Svetlana. Thank you for this question, Svetlana. So I would say that you might have a learning intention and then a stretch learning intention. You might have 3 levels of learning intentions, for example. So I'll give you the example of my children's school again. They have classes which are differentiated, and they have 3 sets of learning intentions and learning activities that the students self-select. So if it's maths, for example, the student can say, oh, I want number 1, I want number 2, I want number 3. And there's a learning intention given by the teacher at the beginning of the lesson, and how that is implemented and the success criteria for that comes out in these differentiated worksheets and differentiated success criteria. So I think it is possible, but you won't be able to give different learning intentions for each student because you're going to have 35 students, but you can provide levels of learning intentions. Are learning intentions and learning outcomes the same? Says Moshina. For the purposes of this presentation, they are the same. They're used fairly interchangeably. I actually use learning intentions because that's the vocabulary that we use in the thought leadership papers that you've seen. But different people say learning outcomes, so it's just a feature of language. And there are lots of things that are like that, that maybe are slightly different but close enough to be the same. So I talk about assessment for learning a lot because I really think it's the most positive way to give feedback and drive learning forwards in the classroom and avoid overuse of summative assessment. But some people will say learner-oriented assessment, some people will say integrated learning and assessment, and there are lots of different ways to say the same thing. So I think that's a really good question to ask. For the intentions of this presentation, learning intentions and learning outcomes are the same. Oh, we've got so I'm trying to scroll through to get to a few more. There's a question from Guadalupe saying, could you share the link? I'm sure that will be shared. How many types of feedback do we have? I gave you 7 features of effective feedback, and the video will be shared and the paper will be shared. So I think, how many types of feedback do we have? I think you're talking about the 7 features of effective feedback. Great question from Sandar. How can we help our students to give feedback on their own or on their peers? And again, I think this really comes down to having some solid learning intentions and success criteria, because your students aren't trained teachers, but they need to be able to self-assess and peer assess because they're really valuable experience, right? So if you can give your students the success criteria to give themselves feedback or to give their peers feedback, then that is probably the best way to do that. Handan has got a really excellent point in capital letters. So they're obviously very frustrated by this. We spend hours to give written feedback, however, they just do not take them into consideration. And I think I know why, Handan. I think it's because you spend hours doing it, because your students, aren't going to be able to engage that much with, I mean, depending on the level, I don't know your context, so I'm just giving you an opinion. They're not going to be able to spend a long time reading through pages of feedback. They just need 2 or 3 bullet points linked to the success criteria that you've given. So if the success criteria is accurate use of the present simple, you just want to focus on that. And if you do that, you've got a narrower feedback that you're giving, and it's more digestible by the students. And then you need to follow that up with some actions. So we talked about strategies, not solutions. Hours of written feedback is maybe a bit solution-y over strategy. But if you give your students some feedback, we'll use the present simple again and say, you didn't conjugate this verb, go away and do this worksheet, then that's maybe going to be more meaningful for them. I wouldn't spend hours giving written feedback unless it's a feature of your institution and you have to do that. I just don't think it's best practice or best use of your time. And then Loris, I think this is probably the last question, Sean, given time. It says, how do you address the student who disagrees with your feedback? I think the way you do this, Loris, is you just be very factual. It's any conversation you have with somebody where there's a disagreement, just stick to the facts. Make it about the task, don't make it about the student. I don't know your context, I don't know your example. If you think the student's pronunciation in a particular area isn't very good, record them, play it back to them, and stick to the facts. If they can see themselves, if you can encourage them to self-assess so that they come to the same opinion as you, then you're not going to have that situation anymore. So stick to the facts. Okay, I think my time's up, Sean. So do you want me to
I think next time you can moderate yourself. You're so good at looking after it that you don't need me.
Oh.
So that's good.
I'm sorry.
No, it was a compliment. You're absolutely bang
okay.
on time with everything and did everything. Well done. Thank you very much. It's good.
Thank you, everybody, for your time today, and thank you for your engagement in the chat. It's been great being here.